Welcome to my scientifically informed insider look at mental health topics. If you find this video to be interesting or helpful, please like it and subscribe to my channel.
Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today's question asks if Chris Watts is a RageType murderer. So I'll describe briefly what happened in this Chris Watts case. I've covered it more thoroughly in other videos. Another question here is, and it's related to this Chris Watts question, can pent-up rage really lead to murder? So kind of a theme of rage and then specifically looking at this one particular case. So of course Chris Watts and the other people involved in this case are all real people. So it's important to note here that I'm not diagnosing anybody, only speculating about what could be happening in a case like this. So with the murderer Chris Watts, we see somebody who killed his wife and unborn child, and then his two daughters about 45 minutes later. And this case has attracted a lot of attention because it's still kind of a mystery. We don't really know why Chris Watts did this, although, of course, there are many theories. Now, he claims the murder of his wife and unborn child, that murder was impulsive, done in a moment of rage. It's harder to believe, of course, that the murder of his daughters was done in a rage. It seemed to be more planned. So many doubt that these murders were impulsive, but I'll use this as part of the premise to explain the RageType murderer and to look at this case. Even if the Chris Watts family murder case involved premeditated murder, there are myriad examples of murders that took place in large part because of rage. And as indicated before in the question, there is even a name for it, RageType murder. Now what gets tricky here, of course, is that premeditated crimes can still involve impulsivity. So, of course, with the rage component, we think of impulsivity, but somebody can be thinking about committing a crime, and the rage kind of helps them along. But interestingly, if someone commits murder in order to fulfill a criminal motive for a clear purpose, they would not qualify as a RageType murderer. So this is something to keep in mind when looking at the Chris Watts murder case, and I'll get to this subject a little more in a little bit. Now, in the Chris Watts case, of course, there were a lot of other complexities. He was having an affair. There were fantasies about a life with this affair partner. Nicole Kessinger was her name. Possibly some personality factors that contributed, and maybe low intelligence. There's not really clear evidence one way or the other on intelligence. Although, of course, Chris Watts claimed in an interview that he was assessed as having an IQ of 140. Now, that IQ would be about 2 2/3 standard deviations above the mean, so that seems pretty unlikely. But either way, looking at the case, it's not clear whether he was intelligent or not. But even with all these factors, again, kind of going with the narrative of impulsivity, most people could have controlled the violent tendencies in the same situation as Chris Watts was in. People can, in essence, snap. That does happen, although it rarely leads to murder. We see people all the time who lose control of their anger and assault other people, drive aggressively, yell and scream at people, break objects, smash things, but they still exercise a degree of control. And for that matter, those who commit a RageType murder still exercise a degree of control. For example, they still try to evade capture and cover up evidence of the crime. Now, before I get too far in describing this RageType murderer, it is important to understand that the kind of rage I'm talking about here isn't the kind we see in self-defense, like when somebody's defending a family member or their own person. It's understandable that people in this type of crisis situation will react with rage, and sometimes they don't always act appropriately. For example, a parent defending a child may use excessive force, although of course a lot of people would understand why. What's really disturbing, of course, is when there's no threat and somebody converts their anger into aggression, when they fall victim to their own impulsivity. And we see really two different expressions of this, disorganized and organized. Chris Watts didn't just randomly swing his arms about or throw things around the house and just happen to kill somebody. He carried out a specific murder of people he wanted to kill. So he was organized in the expression of his rage, if in fact rage is what was working here, if we have a situation where he was impulsive. So there are a variety of theories about how people give in to anger, right? How impulsivity leads to problems. And essentially it's a war fought inside of two personality traits, conscientiousness and neuroticism. So if we look just briefly at the 5-factor model, we see 5 major personality traits. I remember them through the acronym OCEAN. Openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. So with high conscientiousness, we see this results in excellent self-control and resistance to reacting based on emotion. With low conscientiousness, we see this is associated with not caring about how people feel, acting impulsively, and not appreciating the consequences of one's behavior. Now over to neuroticism. With low neuroticism, we see low amounts of anger. Stimuli doesn't seem to lead to an angry response. But with high neuroticism, we see that somebody's going to experience anger even when anger wouldn't be the appropriate emotion. Now paradoxically, of course, low neuroticism is associated with low empathy, which is also associated with a higher probability of committing violent crime. So we see it's actually important to experience emotions, to have feelings. We wouldn't want to be without any emotions. But if we have too much of an experience of emotionality, that's problematic, and too little is problematic. Now, in a sense, the agreeableness trait is tied into this as well. Someone who's highly disagreeable would be interpreting stimuli as more threatening than it really would be, which could lead to anger, but of course this would still be moderated by both conscientiousness and neuroticism. So those two traits are really the gatekeepers in terms of experiencing anger and acting on the anger. So what about this theory about pressure, what some have called repressed anger? If you keep the anger in long enough, it will come out. This is the theory. So you need to punch a pillow or some other inanimate object that would not result in anybody's harm to slowly release the anger. This would function like a relief valve, so to speak. We see this as one of the theories here with Chris Watts, that he was angry at his wife, at his situation, at his whole life, and that anger was released all at the same time. It built up and was released in one moment, and that led to a murderous rage and a murderous action. The only problem with this theory, of course, is that's not how anger works. People who repeatedly control or redirect anger, who do not act on the impulse of anger, gain greater control over anger over a long period of time. People who routinely engage in aggression, even aggression that doesn't harm people, exhibit less control over anger. Now, controlling anger is different than suppressing anger. Controlling anger recognizes that there may be a reason to be angry, that the anger could be justified. Now, sometimes there's no reason to be angry, but in instances where there is a reason, controlling anger still allows for that. It allows for that justification of the feeling of anger. So suppressing anger is when we try to trick ourselves into believing that the feelings of anger are not justified. Now, another option, of course, is redirecting anger, but not into any type of aggression, because again, that won't lead to a good place, but rather into something constructive, so let the anger contribute to a sense of purpose that's pro-social and positive and might actually lead to a solution for the problem. So putting the energy towards something that can help fix whatever's causing the anger. So with all this in mind, what about the theory of the RageType murder in the case of Chris Watts? We know something about these types of murders, and we see that some of the behavior that Chris Watts exhibited was consistent with the RageType murder. With this type, we see an uncontrollable explosive rage reaction, and this is actually fairly common in terms of when murder does occur. This is a common type of murder. Now, in terms of personality profiles and mental health profiles, these types of murders are often described as normal, with no history of psychopathology or violence. So no history of having mental disorders or mental health symptoms, and no history of aggression. Now, even though a mental health history is usually absent, there is evidence that depressive symptomology is somewhat common. So someone can have symptoms of depression without meeting the criteria for a mental disorder. And these symptoms of depression seem to occur or be observed prior to the act of murder. Now, what's interesting is that theories kind of link this experience of depression to narcissistic injury. So this idea that the murderer was humiliated or shamed by the individual that they murdered. Now, another theory is that the murderer was worried about losing someone, right? So you have kind of two different theories that explain the depression or that are associated with the depression. What's interesting here in the Chris Watts case is you really see evidence of both, right? There's some evidence that he was unhappy in his marriage and felt that he was being put down or minimized or not respected, and there's evidence that he was worried about losing someone, Nicole Kessinger, right? So he had kind of both sides of that depression piece potentially contributing into his thoughts and his feelings. Now, rage-type murderers are typically not psychopathic and typically do not have antisocial personality traits. Now, with Chris Watts, we see some evidence that he did have some psychopathy, perhaps low neuroticism, but then at other times he demonstrates more or less high neuroticism, like when he confessed to the police that whole kind of weird incident. He seemed kind of distressed and not in control and not calm. Now, I mentioned before, rage-type offenders usually do not have a criminal history. Chris Watts did not have a criminal history. They show few signs of being sadistic or perverse in terms of the motives for the violence. But here in the Chris Watts case, of course, we do see sadism and we do see perverse motives. So he didn't really line up with the rage-type murderer there. We also see that they're not belligerent or impulsive in their general approach, so how they appeared before the murders. And I think most people would agree Chris Watts did not appear to be belligerent or impulsive before the murderous act. So the rage-type murder has been described as rational, coherent, and controlled, but someone whose homicidal acts have a bizarre and apparently senseless quality. And that statement does seem to line up with Chris Watts. Other features that line up here would be that the relationships of a rage-type murder, again prior to a homicidal act, appear to be shallow and cold. And we see that Chris Watts' wife did describe him more or less in that way shortly before the murders. We also see that individuals like this are not overtly violent, and they tend to be conforming in their behavior. And again, before the murder, he did appear to be conforming at many levels to societal pressures, including family pressures. We see deep feelings of inadequacy, strong dependency needs, this is pretty interesting, as well as apparent passivity in their general disposition. So, constantly preoccupied with a sense of isolation and alienation. So if we compare this to the Chris Watts case, of course, we see he did appear to be dependent on both his wife and the person he was cheating with. And he did seem, again, to have passivity. He may have been preoccupied with a sense of isolation, alienation, worried about alienation from the mistress. So maybe the relationship with the mistress satisfied his need for dependency. And it could be related to a borderline personality structure, which of course is also tied in with the rage-type murder profile. And the last part I'll cover here in terms of the alignment between Chris Watts and the rage-type murderer. There's an over-controlled pattern of behavior with the rage-type murderer. And we've seen many theories in terms of Chris Watts, in terms of his family life, both when he was married and before that. Did he have a controlling mother? Did he have a controlling wife? And many people have kind of speculated that both these things could have occurred. So, in many ways, Chris Watts does appear to be a rage-type murderer, but he also had a clear motive for the crimes. I mentioned that before, which kind of throws this theory into a spin again. So he has a lot of characteristics that match what we know from the research literature, what we see with the rage-type murderer, but again, that mysterious component, the clear motive, just doesn't line up. And to whatever degree he may have premeditated the murders, that doesn't line up very well at all. But again, I mentioned that premeditation can coexist with impulsivity. So it's not like you only have to have one or the other. Now, I know whenever I talk about the Chris Watts case or rage or homicide or any of these topics, there are going to be a variety of opinions. People who agree with me, who disagree with me, who have other thoughts. Please put those opinions and thoughts in the comment section. They always generate a really interesting dialogue. As always, I hope you found this description of the rage-type murderer as compared to the Chris Watts case to be interesting. Thanks for watching.